Morning, everybody, or good afternoon, or good evening, actually, depending where you are in the world. And welcome to this year's University of Liverpool Football Industries webinar. Thank you for joining us. My name is Will Lloyd, and I am the CEO of Global Sports, which is the world's leading digital talent solutions business for the global sports industry. I have some good news, or some breaking news, for our friends looking for jobs in Australia. This morning, we have just managed to secure a number of key roles for the FIFA Women's World Cup down in Australia. They're looking for a large number of staff, and those jobs will be available on the Global Sports platform from Monday. So if you're looking to start or develop your career in Australia, that will be the place to have a look. However, today's session is one of the broadest topics that I've ever had the privilege to moderate. And whilst we only have 1 hour, I'm not sure that if we had 1 week, I'd be able to do this topic justice. But the topic is, how effective is governance in English football? And we are very fortunate to have 3 great speakers and experts of the game, representing the English Football League, the English Premier League, and the author of the government fan-led review on English football to discuss this topic over the next 1 hour. There's not many housekeeping rules, but questions, please fire questions through the platform. I'll break occasionally to look at those questions, and we'll try and get those answered as we go through the hour. My previous experience suggests that we will get through as many as we can, but unfortunately, we won't be able to get through all of them. It's a very popular tool to direct questions specifically to individuals, so we'll see how we get on. However, without much further ado, I would like to introduce you to our 3 panelists. I will kindly ask them to introduce themselves and share a brief career history. Then I'll sort of crack on, give you a little bit of a background to what we're looking to talk about, and then we will start the interesting discussion on the effectiveness of governance in English football. So, Chris, could I start with you to introduce yourself and just share a little bit of a career history? Then, if that's okay, we'll go on to Rebecca, and then we'll ask Rick to close that session, or that's part of it, the session.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a sports lawyer by trade. Started off working in the City of London as a mergers and acquisitions lawyer. Got involved in sport that way. Worked for many years in private practice, advising a variety of different sports. But probably you'd say that the bread and butter of that was advising football clubs, predominantly English football clubs, but quite a few further afield. And since then, I've been a general counsel. I've had senior roles at four different Premier League clubs, also in cricket with the International Cricket Council, which governs cricket, and with the Super League, which is the Premier League equivalent for rugby league. And most relevant for today is I had the honour of being the head of the Football Governance Review, where I worked very closely with former Sports Minister Tracy Crouch to review the governance and regulation of English football and produce recommendations, which I'm glad to say have largely been adopted, are now government policy and are moving into the implementation phase. Which includes some I think from my perspective, welcome developments in the governance and regulation of English football.
Thank you, Chris.
Hi everyone. I'm the director of football governance. Director of football administration and governance at Tottenham. I've been here for just over 8 years. I'm actually an accountant by trade, but came into football having previously worked in tennis, combining my accountancy qualification with my love of sport, my sports science degree. I worked at Queen's Park Rangers when I first came into football, was there as Director of Finance and took on a broader range of responsibilities there, and then moved across to Spurs just in a football-only role. I currently sit on a number of representative bodies, including the Women's Super League and Women's Championship Board, the Professional Game Board and FA Council.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Rebecca.
Oh, hi, I'm Rick Perry, Chair of the EFL, Vice Chair of the Football Association, was the founding Chief Executive of the Premier League quite a long time ago, had 12 years as Chief Executive at Liverpool FC, and immediately coming back into English football with the EFL, I had 3 years on UEFA's CFCB overseeing financial fair play from a European perspective.
Thank you very much, Rick. And thank you, all three of you, for joining us today. Just to put all this into perspective and to provide some sort of footballing context, this country, as in England, created the game. First football club was created in 1857. The Football Association was created in 1863. The first Football League was created in 1888. And the Premier League was created in 1992. English football, undeniably a success story, watched by billions globally, and with some of the most exciting players, clubs and stories of any league. It's the country's #1 sport. As I mentioned, the EPL is the most successful league in the world from a revenue and audience perspective. You would think that it's never been better. And you would think that football is in great shape. However, English football is currently endangered by the high and growing risk of financial failure among clubs across its top 5 tiers. And there have been over 60 instances of clubs going into administration since 1992. And we have already lost historic clubs like Bury and Macclesfield Town. So I'm going to open up this debate or this discussion on how effective is governance in English football by asking Rick, in your opinion, how effective is governance in English football and why?
Okay, so that's quite a big question. I'll
Yes.
see you all in an hour's time.
Yeah.
I actually think English football is in a pretty good state. There are challenges for sure. Fan-led review came in the wake of Bury. It was part of the Conservatives' manifesto. I guess the catalyst that actually triggered the start of the review was the aborted European Super League, which is slightly ironic in that it didn't happen. So it was stopped. I think a lot of things are done extremely well. In terms of why clubs are endangered, why they go bust, it's because they spend too much. Really, really simple. This isn't complex. And I think football was doing a lot of good things in terms of regulation. We'd, at the EFL, put in place new owners and directors tests, which would have prevented a repeat of Bury. That was a relatively simple loophole to close. But nevertheless, we can always do things significantly better. We're getting a regulator. That's going to change. We at the EFL are totally committed to better regulation and governance. And for me, what does good governance look like? It's all about consistency. It's all about transparency. Transparency comes right at the top of the list for me. And football, and I guess sport in general, I guess prefers to operate in the dark in many occasions, doesn't really like transparency. But for me, transparency comes right up at the top there. Accountability, consistency, transparency, doing things well. We are improving regulation in terms of cost control, owners and directors within the EFL all the time. We actually genuinely thought football could sort many of the problems out. As Chris will know, we met the fan-led review panel on a number of occasions. tried to argue the case that we thought we could do it ourselves. Clear we were never going to win that. It was pretty clear that a regulator was going to be recommended. And actually, we embraced that. We kind of pivoted our position and said, not a problem. We can work with the regulator, because at the end of the day, if we're totally committed to better regulation, it doesn't really matter who does it. We're not afraid of a regulator, provided they do it well. Independence, again, key, and that's what a regulator will bring. We've set up an independent unit to work with the EFL. UEFA were reasonably good at independence. And again, that's something that football can improve on, was improving on. But as I said, we see the regulator as opportunity. We don't see it as a major threat. We think football will thrive under the regulator. We'll have more clarity. We'll have some certainty. So we're very much working with the regulator. But I mean, the other thing, maybe this is the next question, but you know, from our point of view, the EFL, our purpose is making clubs sustainable at every level of the pyramid. This is absolutely crucial. And to make clubs sustainable, in very simple terms, we need redistribution of revenues to make them solvent, and we need better regulation to make sure they don't go and waste it. So fairly simple remedy. We're enthusiastic about the government white paper, because government, we think, has embraced many of the things that we're concerned about. We think it's very workable. So said we don't fear the change, we don't fear the regulator, and we see a bright future for football.
Thank you, Rick. Fascinating sort of insight into the EFL clubs. Rebecca, we're going to come on to you in a second, you know, just to talk a little bit more about perhaps the Premier League clubs, but I'm just going to bring in Chris at this stage. Chris, you know, clearly you were the author of the fan-led review of football governance. You know, in any government that wants to do a review, that it suggests that they are looking to reform or address these issues. What do you think are the key elements of the review that are going to fundamentally transform the game?
Well, Rick's already mentioned it. I mean, the independent regulator, that is going to be a new development. But you know, I'm not too dissimilar in my position from Rick, in the sense that I think England does lots of things well, and English football governance does lots of things well. And the recommendations in the fan-led review and in the subsequent, you know, government white papers have not been replace all of the governance of English football with something else. It relates to a very narrow area of regulation that we did feel that there was a problem. But then you have to go through a process of, you know, is there a, you know, not just is there a problem, but are you know, is some form of intervention by the government the best thing or the best way to fix it, or are there other ways to fix it and address it? And the conclusion we reached was actually on this particular issue around how clubs are run and the financial fragility of clubs in you know, to potential future shocks. We felt that independent statutory regulation and an independent statutory regulator would be better placed to do that, for a variety of reasons. You know, a statutory regulator, of course, has more clout behind it than a football regulator, because it does have statutory powers. But also, you know, the independence, as Rick says, which gives the regulator the opportunity to devise and pursue genuinely what it considers to be the best solutions, because unlike the football bodies, it doesn't necessarily need to get the consent of the entities that are going to be subject to that regulation, who quite rationally very often view regulatory proposals or governance proposals in the narrow prism of how does it affect my position? Now, I say rationally because there's nothing wrong with an individual club trying to protect their own position, but that's just not a great way to deal with systemic and long-term regulatory or governance issues in a lot of cases. So we felt that an independent statutory regulator would be better placed to address those things and act in the best interest of the game. And as Rick says, provide a degree of certainty, because a statutory regulator as well, it has clear objectives. It has to produce clear guidance so that regulated entities can have certainty. It has limits on its powers and authority. So you as a regulated entity have far greater certainty about where you stand in relation to that regulation.
Interesting. And Rebecca, clearly representing a Premier League club, similar kind of challenges, but in a much more different environment. What's your opinion on how effective governance is in English football?
Yeah, so I agree with sort of Rick's position that actually we're not in a bad place. I think there's an awful lot of good stuff, and I don't think that to paint a picture that we were in a really bad way and needed a lot of change would be accurate. I think we're starting from a good starting point, which isn't to say that everything is perfect and there's no room for us to grow and develop, because of course there is. But there's actually a lot of governance and a lot of regulation across football, and one of the concerns that we have is around things not opposing each other. And so as a club that regularly plays in Europe, not only are we under obviously Premier League regulation, FA, but also UEFA. And for an independent regulator to come in on top of that, one of our concerns was that everything kind of works together and in harmony. We've not got opposing regulations that make it very hard to operate as a club.
Okay, and if we sort of move this question on, and the concept that football clubs are central to many communities, and the benefits of a thriving club extend well beyond their fans, which is why the government is clearly considering this critical, how important it is to look at clubs and how to put them on a sustainable footing. I think there was one quote in the fan-led review that said football clubs should be classed as heritage. They are integral to many families and to cities and towns in a way that's not replicated in other businesses. Clubs need to be protected from asset stripping and situations such as Bury. Rick, just to come back to you as clearly chairman of sort of five leagues within the EFL. What's your view on this? I mean, some people would say preservation is the key. Other people would say that you can amalgamate clubs and still keep that community feel, but just make it a bigger environment. What's your how important to you is this community feel and the importance of community outside of football as a sport?
It's incredibly important, not just at our level, because Premier League clubs make huge investments in the community too. So this isn't nothing that I say is about Premier League versus EFL. Everything I talk about is a pyramid of clubs, because again, what's fundamental to the English game is the ability to rise up and down the pyramid without facing catastrophe. But certainly lower down the EFL, the clubs are absolutely the beating heart of their communities. And what I say about our owners is we have 72 social entrepreneurs. We commissioned a report recently to look at the social value of the work that our clubs do in their communities. And first year we've done it came out at £860 million. That's a really, really big number.
Wow.
And that's across things like education, physical health, mental health, employability, crime fighting initiatives. We've got 10,000 separate partnerships around the country with different organizations. And the reason I use the phrase social entrepreneurs, our entrepreneurs get things done. They're agile, they're responsive, but they've got a conscience. So, and we saw during lockdown how clubs and communities came together, the importance of the clubs. Port Vale, which is one of our great examples of a community club, served 300,000 hot meals during lockdown, which is an extraordinary initiative. But at the same time, and there is a slight paradox here, and one of the challenges that I bore Rebecca to death on, in fact, she'll probably leave the call any second now, is our clubs are all massively dependent on owner funding in order to survive. So within the championship, every single year, our owners are writing out checks for, on average, 16 million each. It is the most expensive lottery ticket on the planet. So owners do get a lot of criticism, but at the same time, the clubs are very much dependent on those owners for keeping clubs alive. And what we're trying to do in terms of making clubs sustainable is to reduce that dependence on the owner funding, because then everything will be better balanced, clubs will be more resilient. And in that sense, our aims, I think, very much mirror those of government. And we look forward to working alongside the regulator. I think Rebecca made a really good point that we have to be concerned about duplication, overlap, how are things going to work together. But primarily, the regulator is going to have a licensing system for clubs and it's going to take over the owners and directors test. We see that dovetailing very nicely alongside our responsibility for running competitions and competition regulations, but the aims of producing more sustainable and resilient clubs, we're absolutely in tune with.
And you talk about 16 million sort of check for each owner of each club, and reducing the dependency of basically that cash to support each club. Where are the big wins going to be coming from in terms of reducing that dependency? 60 million is quite a lot of cash. So where is the quick wins of reducing that amount of money or sourcing it from a different place?
Well, they're not quick wins because nothing happens quickly in football, and they're not necessarily easy wins. And I don't want to bore you with statistics, but I will quote one. When we formed the Premier League back in '92, in the first year of the Premier League, the turnover of the FA Premier League Limited, which was broadly its broadcasting revenues, was £45 million. The turnover of the EFL, which we were leaving behind, and I'll touch on the irony of me being involved with the EFL now and we formed the Premier League before anybody else does. But the EFL's turnover the same year was 34 million. So there was a gap of £11 million. The gap is now 3 billion. So the Premier League's turnover has gone up 70 times. The EFL's turnover has gone up 5.5 times. That's where the challenge lies. And as I said, there are people who say, well, the Premier League's just a private enterprise. Why should it share its money? Well, that frankly is facile nonsense. It's a sporting competition. And as I said, the health of the pyramid is the ability of clubs to rise and fall. You look at our League One table at the moment, which is an incredibly exciting end to the season, but the 4 clubs in the playoff places all have significant Premier League experience. And yet conversely, in the Premier League doing well at the moment, we have Brighton and Bournemouth and Brentford who've been right down at the bottom of the EFL. That's the very strength of the English game and something we must preserve. But the way the gap has widened, which again the government clearly identified in the white paper, is the one that needs to be addressed. And our premise is that it's as important for the clubs in the Premier League to address that as it is for our clubs, because the cliff edge, the gap between the Championship and the Premier League is roughly 100 million between what the bottom of the Premier League and the top of the Championship. That's just unbridgeable.
And that 100 million is in earnings from being in the Premier League versus being
that's basically the media revenue distribution.
Yeah. Wow. Rebecca, there's clearly you're at the other end of this, still in the top half of the Premier League, also have been initially part of the European Super League. What's your view on the importance of maintaining this football pyramid and the ecosystem that goes with it?
Yeah, look, the football pyramid is vital to English football, and it's part of what makes it special. It's part of what's made us successful, and no one wants to not maintain the pyramid. I think we have to be realistic about what that costs and what it looks like. But the principle of maintaining the pyramid and keeping all those clubs alive is something that everyone is on board with. I think the challenge we've got, and sort of Rick alluded to it there, is the gaps. The financial gaps are growing bigger. And if I look with my club hat on, we're trying to compete in Europe, and we're trying to compete against some of the biggest clubs in the world. And so, we're looking at what does that look like versus what does the gap between the bottom of the Premier League and the top of the Championship looks like versus what does the gap between Championship and League One and League Two, etc. And so, there are different issues all the way up and down the pyramid, and it's trying to find something that balances all of those and makes things sensible at every level, and doesn't damage us when we're trying to compete in Europe, but equally doesn't damage the lower half of the pyramid either. And it's all about balance for me. Well, that's the key.
And wearing your different hats that you do, how does that compare with your non-Tottenham hat, if you see what I mean? So the women's football, there's another hat you've got as well. I can't remember which one that was, but
but certainly in terms of women's football, it's very immature in terms of its structure versus men's football. We only have one professional division, the WSL, the Championship, which sits beneath it is semi-pro, and then below that in tier 3 and 4, it's effectively amateur football. And so, as we start to grow the women's game, we want to maintain a pyramid structure, but the women's pyramid is a long way away from the men's in terms of size and clearly in terms of investment. And one of the things that we need to do is think about the best way to move that women's pyramid forward. But I think everybody is comfortable that, in the men's game, we've got a really good structure that's unique to England in terms of the amount of professional clubs that we have and the way that the clubs can move up and down the pyramid. And we want to take the good things from that and put them into women's football, but acknowledging that, there are differences between men's and women's football, and not least of all the starting position that we're in at the moment.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. So the difference, going back to the men's game and this 100 million that clearly is a cliff edge for both parties, Championship going up and clearly for the Premier League going down. Has that been resolved? That clearly there's parachute payments and what have you, and people are saying that actually the parachute payments are not fit for purpose. What's your sort of view on how to create that greater equality rather than just a cliff edge?
Can I jump in on that one?
Please do, Chris.
Before Rick does on his parachute payments, and I think it's a point that runs through both Rick and Rebecca's comments in that, and this is maybe one of the advantages of being able to step away from the stakeholder management and kind of analyze things at a higher level, but in more depth. What we're really talking about and the cliff edge and all these kind of things is considering more broadly what are the incentives within the market, and what behaviors are those incentives driving, and are those behaviors really what we want to be seeing within football. And in relation to the cliff edge, the reason that and particularly the one between the Premier League and the Championship, though that's not the only one, the major concern from a market point of view is that it's driving behaviours in the Championship, which is, Rick alluded to the lottery ticket, it is kind of gambling.
Yeah.
And overstretching yourselves to try to achieve the financial reward of being in the Premier League. But of course, without getting deep into game theory or anything like that, however many clubs within the Championship try to gamble to get that, there will still only ever be 3 promotion spots at the end of each year. So there is a limited opportunity. So 22 clubs risk it all to get up. In a single year, 19 are going to fail. But it's not only that behaviour which is the concern. And look, you could point to any number of clubs where there's been issues coming up, and I always refer to the 2019 Championship playoff between Aston Villa and Derby as the Russian roulette playoff, because both were on a real kind of knife edge to achieve promotion, and whoever lost that game was always going to end up in deep trouble, and Derby did, and Aston Villa got promoted, so avoided that. But it's not just the behaviour that drives in the Championship, it's actually the behaviour that drives at the lower end of the Premier League as well, in that clubs are overstretching themselves to try to stay in the Premier League because of the size of the gap. So we saw evidence throughout the review of a fairly consistent pattern that once clubs came up, even if they managed to stay up, what you tended to see was in year one there might be a bit of a profit and a bit of financial return. But from year 2 onwards, the losses tended to pile up and get back to the same as, or if not higher levels than the Championship. So, that's one illustration. But the reason the cliff edge is important is not just in individual clubs and the effect it has on those coming up and down, but the behaviour it drives around those, for those other clubs around that. And that's before getting on to parachute payments, which Rick is the expert on, and I wouldn't want to go too far into that and cut him off. But
steal his thunder.
If you are a club in the Championship that is not in receipt of parachute payments and you want to get promoted, you've got a big financial gap to make up to those clubs that are receiving parachute payments, and that might be the right point to let Rick talk.
Well, but before we go on to that, I'm just gonna. There's questions are coming in thick and fast, so I'm just gonna try and get some of these answered. So from an anonymous attendee, one of the questions is there a view on why so many clubs, especially in EFL, still seem to fall foul of various regulations and incur fines, points, deductions, e.g. Derby, Wigan in recent years? Is this a question of poor governance at the clubs or just trying their luck? Anybody want to answer that? If not, I'm sure Rick would love to.
Well, having been involved in some of those cases, without divulging anything confidential, it's back to the pressures, and Chris has touched on the market incentives, and it's that over reliance on stretching forever to be in the promised land. And if we didn't have such a major cliff edge, then I did touch a lot earlier on what's really important for the pyramid is the ability of clubs to rise and fall. So it shouldn't be a catastrophe when you fall out the Premier League, and it shouldn't be a catastrophe when you get promoted into the Premier League. So there needs to be a smoothing. And in terms of breaching the profit and sustainability rules in the Championship, profit and sustainability is a really quaint title for rules in the Championship, given that on average Championship clubs spend 125% of their revenues on wages. They lose 400 million collectively, and they have debt of 1.7 billion. They are neither profitable nor sustainable. But Chris touched on the Derby versus Aston Villa playoff final. Derby were breaking the financial fair play rules. Why were they doing it? In an effort to get promoted, in an effort to catch the parachute clubs overstretching, Wigan was different. Wigan were deducted points because they went into administration. Why did they go into administration? There's a common theme, I guess, with Derby and with Wigan, because again, it's all about the owner funding and the owner's commitments and the desires of owners to succeed. But the big challenge with owner funding is it's absolutely fantastic until it isn't. So with Wigan, Dave Whelan had performed absolute wonders in keeping Wigan in the Premier League for many years. Had to sell eventually. New owner comes in, Hong Kong-based owner. Now, in terms of future ownership and strategy and owners and directors, you might think there might have been an amber light in terms of why would somebody from Hong Kong want to buy Wigan Athletic? And I guess the answer is the dream they were sold was come and invest in Wigan. It's cheap. They've got a Premier League pedigree. And in no time at all, they'll be back in the Premier League. And all of a sudden he finds that it's costing him 12 million a year just to stand still near the bottom of the Championship, and fairly rapidly decides, I don't want to do that anymore. Derby, we saw similar with Mel Morris. Mel had put hundreds of millions into the club and then suddenly decided he wanted to stop. At which point the club has a major, major problem. We very nearly lost Derby. Fortunately, David Clowes, local boy, came in at the 11th hour and rescued them. But points deductions have sent them down into League One. They're having to sort of regroup, start again. But it's all about desperately trying to rise. Now, listen, it's understandable because football is the ultimate in competition. Everybody wants to do better. Everybody wants to rise. What we have to try to do is to make sure it's done in a way that is sustainable and isn't putting at risk those heritage assets and this is where the government came in, of course. It's how do you keep competition, how do you keep excitement, but alongside sustainability and resilience of clubs. And there's no single right answer. And if you look at owner funding, for example, nobody wants to stifle investment, but at the same time, clubs have got to operate within their means, and nobody has found the right answer to that balance.
Rick, just introducing another question from a guy called William Newman. Upon promotion to the EPL, besides salaries, are there any other major expenses compared to what was in the Championship, or is it just purely this sort of one-dimensional dream that is purely driven by the cost of players?
That's the immediate cost, and Rebecca is very well placed to answer this one, because clearly what tends to happen, particularly when clubs stay beyond a year in the Premier League, they are producing a Premier League infrastructure, and Tottenham is a brilliant example of that, with arguably the best stadium in the world. So it's not just on the pitch. You have clubs are very professional. They're massive organisations, and one of the issues they find when they're relegated is trying to maintain Premier League standards down in the Championship. But I said Rebecca can give you a much better answer on that.
Over to you, Rebecca.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. Yeah,
has Tottenham ever been in the Championship?
We were a founding member of the Premier League, so for the last 30 years, no.
You escaped. Well done.
So as Rick sort of says, player salaries are the immediate cost, but it's salaries for other staff as well. So you need a much bigger operation to run as an effective Premier League club. And then you've got demands on infrastructure. And look, we're lucky because as you've just pointed out, well, we've been in the Premier League a long time. We've got a strong base to build on. We've got an amazing training centre, a great stadium, and we've made huge investments into infrastructure, and we're lucky enough to be able to do that from a stable base. But if you're a club moving up and down between divisions, that becomes a lot harder to put money aside and invest in that infrastructure for the future.
Just going back to a point that you made earlier, Rebecca, there's clearly this sort of cliff edge around 100 million between Championship and Premiership, but then in the Premiership, to win the Premiership, that's another kind of cliff edge, just in terms of how big these global, limitless clubs are that are being created. What in your, what is that difference? Probably based on the financials, but you need 100. You lose 100 million between the Championship and the Premiership. Then you can stay in the Premiership, but then if you want to win the Premiership, what's that kind of gap?
Yeah, and there are some clubs that spend more on salaries than others, regardless of where they are sort of in their relative sort of league position. But in the same way, there's a circa 100 million gap between Championship and Premier League. There's another 100 million for Champions League or not Champions League, and then obviously depending on how well you do. But there's some big deltas in terms of where you are, not necessarily explicitly on your league position, but the competition it then allows you to go and play in. Particularly Champions League is hugely lucrative, and for a club like ours, the difference for us of being Champions League one season and not the others, it again is a quantum beyond 100 million. It's that kind of size of gap. So our cliff edge, and I fully appreciate it's a very different cliff edge than relegation promotion, but our cliff edge is hung around European competition.
Yeah.
I'd also just chuck in, there are cases in the past of clubs that have been in the Premier League for a very long time, and you would think, if the system was working well, 10 odd years in the Premier League would set you up for life, that have then dropped down the league and gone within days of down. So there's something that's uncomfortable about that kind of situation. And I think one of the perhaps issues we were talking specifically about the lower end of the Premier League. In the lower end of the Premier League is, Premier League revenues are such now that most of those clubs can probably outspend most other clubs in Europe now. So the driver for the hot market for wages and transfer fees isn't competing with the rest of Europe. It's actually competing with each other. That's driving that financial behavior. Yeah,
and sometimes it's not the clubs driving it, it's the people behind the clubs in terms of what their attitudes are.
Yeah, as we said, owner funding is great until it's not, and virtually every financial crisis involving a football club is some version of there was an owner who was subsidizing it and suddenly they couldn't or wouldn't for whatever reason. Now that might be because they were using their business, or it might be that they were, in one case, sanctioned by the UK government because of their ties to the Russian state. Now, I mention that one case because, that does illustrate another point, which is you talk about the cultural importance of football clubs. Had Chelsea not been a football club, it wouldn't have been given a special license to continue operating, and it would have closed down on day one of Abramovich being subject to sanctions.
Fascinating. Good insight, Chris. Another question from another anonymous participant. Should supporters be an important stakeholder in the consultation of key decisions? And I guess there's a sort of two-tier system here, Rick, in terms of the EFL and the EPL. What's Chris? Let's go back to you. Well, we're going to let you kick.
Probably easy for me to answer than others. Yeah, I mean, yes. In short, I mean, fans are a crucial stakeholder, arguably the most important stakeholder. Even the owners of the clubs, they're the current owners. But there was a club 100 years before this owner, and they'll hopefully, if we get things right, there'll be a club 100 years after this owner. So absolutely, fans are a key stakeholder, and should be consulted, and there should be mechanisms and better mechanisms within the game for taking into account the fan views, and that doesn't need to be a negative thing for clubs. Most businesses would kill for, you can't use the term in a football context, but would kill for customers that are as loyal as football club fans are to their club. That's not the same thing as saying fans should run the clubs or fans should be on the boards of clubs, but it is saying that it is good business if you are a football club to be taking into account and consulting with your fan base.
Yeah. Rick, is there a good example in the Football League of a club that is either run by its fans or is heavily influenced by the fans making key decisions?
I think there are a lot of examples. There are a limited number of clubs owned by fans, and one of the reasons that it's a limited number is back to the requirement to put in significant amounts of owner funding. When Wigan went into administration, we had a lot of talks with the fan groups and local MPs, all of which were actually very emotional but very constructive. And it was, well, we've got a group of fans, is it going to be feasible for them to take over? To which our immediate response was, well, have they got 12 million quid? Because that is going to be the annual bill. If we had a fairer share of revenues, if we weren't dependent on owner funding, then it might be more viable in the future to look at greater models of fan ownership. I think greater consultation with fans isn't something to be feared. There isn't a business in the world that doesn't consult or think of the needs of its customers. Football gets a bit defensive about it at times, but you know, if you look at Bolton Wanderers, for example, that was a club that's sort of been right through the gamut of the problems of owner funding. The generosity of Eddie Davis kept them in the Premier League and in the upper reaches of the Premier League until he could no longer fund the club, and they then eventually found themselves in League Two, having very, very nearly gone bust along the way. Now on the way back up, vying for promotion from League One with a great ownership group, and an ownership group that puts being at the heart of the community in consultation with fans front and centre of everything that it does. So yeah, you know, Bolton is almost a microcosm of just about everything that I've been talking about, with a really decent model now of what should be a sustainable club on the way back up again.
And Rebecca, from the Premiership's perspective, and from a club within the Premiership, you know, how do you view your well, clearly your customers, but supporters? Are they involved in any key decisions or important stakeholder decisions?
Yeah, so the Premier League has recently introduced the fan engagement standard, and as part of that, we at Spurs have introduced a fan advisory board, as have a number of other Premier League clubs. And as part of the fan engagement standard, all Premier League clubs will have a requirement to consult to a certain degree on certain decisions, and so that's very much part of the fabric of the Premier League going forward now. And I think that we all recognise the importance of our fans. You know, there is no football without fans, and it's trying to find the best way to meaningfully engage them. That's the challenge. Okay,
fantastic. I'm going to move on. There's a couple of other questions that keep coming through. One on multi-club models, but I'm conscious of time, and I want to talk a little bit about women's football. One of the fastest growing sports in the world. England's national team's success has only made it bigger, and not necessarily better, but certainly bigger. The Women's Super League has seen its attendance increase by 200%, and the average attendances in the Women's Championships are up by 85% since Euro 2022. Rebecca, you're heavily involved in the women's game, as we mentioned earlier. What do you see as some of the challenges and some of the things that the women's game can learn from the men's game, and what are you having to look at differently to make sure that you don't follow the same path?
Yeah, I think, look, it's a really exciting time in the women's game. We were getting some good momentum before COVID. It's taken a little while to get that back, but obviously the girls winning the Euros has given us a big boost, and women's football, as you've just sort of showed in those statistics, is in a really good place. I think the challenge that we've got is there's huge desire to grow the game, but we've got to find a way to fund it. And at the moment, women's football isn't sustainable, and we need to get to a place where it doesn't need subsidy from the men's game or from anywhere else. And that's the real challenge, is how do we continue to drive the product, drive quality and standards, but at the same time drive the revenues that are going to enable us to continue with that. And that's the real balance. We're trying to run quickly and really increase the quality of the product and everything around it, but we're doing that before we're getting the revenues to fund it. And so we need the support of the men's game at the moment to get things going, but hopefully a few years down the line, women's football will be self-sustaining, and that's the ultimate goal for all of us.
Interesting. And Rick, the parallel here is, go back to 1992, when in the first year you drove 34 million worth of revenue, and 45 worth of revenue, and the EFL was 34 million at a very early stage. What lessons do you think that the women's game can learn from the men's game and do things slightly differently to ensure longevity and sustainability?
Well, Rebecca knows far more about this than I do. It's not my specialist subject in the way that it is hers, but I think, as she said, it's formative years for the women's game. There is a lot of excitement. There is genuine interest. The women's Euros were tremendous in terms of the attendances, different attendances, different audience to the men's game, but very, very successful. But when we formed the Premier League, it wasn't that the game was immature. I mean, the game had been there for 100 years.
Yeah.
We needed to change the direction. We needed to modernise. And actually, the great success of the Premier League was the fact that we introduced new governance, more independence, more transparency, more accountability, all the things that I touched on. We sort of created a structure fit for the 21st century, bypassing the 20th in the process. But as I said, it's not that the game was not mature. The game was very mature. So the bigger clubs, the big five, as then were starting to become internationally known. They were massively popular, and the potential was already there. And what we did do, and it was a lucky accident in some ways, that the formation of the Premier League coincided with the birth of pay TV, and we were well placed to take advantage. Difference, as Rebecca said, with the women's game is it's not mature. It's starting from scratch, and it's no surprise that it's the bigger clubs from the men's game that are putting a lot of money into supporting and growing and developing the women's game. I mean, it's interesting that the women's game is going through at the moment a change in terms of ownership of the league. The leagues have always been embedded within the Football Association, different options being considered, whether that switches to the Premier League, whether it switches to a club-owned model. And certainly there are, some lessons that can be learned from the way we went about things many years ago. But as I said, the starting points are very, very different, and that's something that has to be remembered. And you can't forget that. And as Rebecca said, for the next few years, the game is going to be absolutely dependent on investment from clubs. The commercial revenues are there is no way they're going to keep pace with the rate of development that everybody wants to see.
Interesting. And Chris, you've clearly spoken to a lot of clubs, done a lot of work, clearly on the review. What's your view on the women's game, and what they can learn, or what pitfalls or what opportunities do you think is going on there?
Well, I mean, let me just say, I think there is a very strong moral case for the men's game to support the women's game, not least because we talk about the women's game not being as developed or mature. There is a historic reason for that, which is that the men's game banned the women's game for 50 odd years. So there is a strong moral case for the men's game to be righting that wrong. And had that not happened, the women's game would be much further developed than it is now. I think there's some fantastic things about the women's game that I really hope don't get lost in the commercial development. We heard from numerous fan groups throughout the fan-led review that one of the things, fans of women's teams, that one of the things they really liked was that it hadn't got the hostile tribalism of the men's game, that you could go along to a game and yes, you support your team, but everyone who is there supporting their team is also supporting the women's game more generally, which creates a much kind of better, more collegiate atmosphere. So I think that's great. Women's players don't play act like men's players do. I think that's fantastic, and they should definitely keep that. You see some pretty meaty challenges in the women's game, and the players just get up, brush themselves off, and start running. There's no rolling about or ambulance on the pitch to carry them off. So there's some fantastic things about the women's game, and I think there is a strong moral case that the men's game should be backing the women's game to redress the historic wrong that it did that has delayed the development of the women's game over the course of over the course of the last 100 odd years.
Thank you, Chris. Look, we've only got a few minutes left. We've got more questions than I know what to do with, so I'm very sorry for those that I haven't, whose questions I haven't read out. They are worthy of reading, but unfortunately, time has got the better of us. I think that there's one question I'd like to ask, or two questions I'd like to ask each of you before we go. We've got a lot of students listening from around the world to this webinar. All of whom, or not all of whom, most of whom are looking to either start their career in football or start their career in sport. Most of whom may or may not be involved in doing a master's degree in sport. I'd like to ask each of you in turn what advice you'd give to them in terms of starting their career in sport, and how important do you think a master's degree is as part of their personal development. Rebecca, can I ask you to give your words of wisdom first before we sort of wrap this up?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's no set path to get into football, and a question that people ask me a lot is, how did I get my job? How does someone else get my job? And there is no set path to getting a job in football. And I think for me, it's about do something that you're passionate about. And if you're passionate about football and you're lucky enough to get an opportunity, then take it and put heart and soul into it. And hopefully it will lead you to a more positive place in terms of your career development. But don't get too fixated on there being a set pathway, because there really isn't. Thank you very much. And the importance of a master's degree? Yeah, I think, for depending on, exactly what you want to do, that can really open doors. But again, I wouldn't say it's the only way to do it. But clearly, if you've got a master's degree and someone else hasn't, then you've got another step on the ladder towards where you're trying to get to. So, thank you very much indeed, Rebecca. Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I'm slightly embarrassed to be giving career advice on a call with Rebecca and Rick, who are both more successful than me. But I mean, the biggest thing that I've learned over the course of my career is just to be open to different learning opportunities and to continue on with different learning opportunities. And the fan-led review was an example of that for me, because not just the actual work of the fan-led review, but dealing with proper market regulators like the FCA and other people like that, and seeing their approach. I'm now evangelical about the need for sport and sports regulation to learn from the 40-50 years of development and practice that has grown up around market and economic regulators. So I think always be open to learning, and always be open to learning that isn't necessarily obviously directly linked to sport or labeled as sport, because there is plenty that you can bring in and learn from other industries, because in a lot of ways, and regulation and governance is perhaps one of them. Sport is despite the popularity of the on-pitch product, sport is still quite old-fashioned and in that regard, and potentially has a lot to learn. So I think, perhaps it ties up both questions, but continue to be open to learning and development throughout your career.
Thank you, Chris. Wise words. Rick, if you've got a view on that, a quick view.
Yeah, be persistent. Think about volunteering. Make your CV stand out. Show your commitment. I mean, I think it's interesting that in terms of our major clubs, they're massive names, enormous. I hate to use the word brands in the context of football, but they are enormous brands, but they're relatively small businesses and employ fewer people than people might imagine. So there aren't that many opportunities, and every opportunity is massively oversubscribed. So do something that's actually going to differentiate you and catch the eye. And as I said, a lot of people get involved in volunteering, working with smaller clubs, working with women's clubs. Many opportunities there. But as I said, be persistent, and as Chris said, keep on learning. That's really important.
Thank you very much indeed, Rick. I would also add to that there is a platform that's funded by the Football Association called the FLDC, so the Football Leadership Diversity Code Careers platform, fldccareers.com, which does have most of the football clubs signed up to that code and are posting their jobs right across the country on for their club. So it's a good source of opportunities that exist there. That unfortunately sort of brings us to a conclusion. I would like to thank our panelists, Rick, Rebecca, and Chris. You have made my job ridiculously easy. I've actually thoroughly enjoyed listening to you three talk about the governance and the effectiveness of governance in English football. I'd like to thank our hosts, Babatunde and his team at Liverpool University, or the University of Liverpool Football Industries, who have been kind enough to help put this on today, and we have helped them deliver it. I think it's been a fascinating session, and I'm very grateful to all of the participants that have also taken some time to listen to these three experts on the chosen topic. So thank you all very much indeed. It's very much appreciated, and look forward to seeing you all again. Cheers, guys. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.